Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may, I'd like to start by adding my very warm thanks and recognition to our magnificent clerk, Tom Goldsmith. The Speaker has already been indelicate enough to mention Tom's extraordinary skill at the jazz piano, but as someone who eats very much at the opposite end of the jazz food chain, can I just say that our loss of him as a clerk is going to be more than made up by his forthcoming history of British jazz. And I hope the House will join me in welcoming that, because it's not going to write itself. Let me start by recognising, on behalf of the whole House, all those men and women from our country and allies who are engaged in the conflict in and around Iran. We thank them for their bravery and their service. But let us not also forget that our great ally, Ukraine, is fighting for her life in the face of an attempted and unprovoked Russian war of conquest. NATO in this country must not allow themselves to be distracted now from giving Ukraine all the support we can. And as we approach International Women's Day this Saturday, may I also note that this week marks the anniversary of Nancy Astor taking her seat in 1919 as the first woman Member of Parliament, a milestone in the long journey towards wider political representation in this House. Mr. Speaker, this was a week in which 3 current or former members of the Labour Party were arrested on charges of spying for China. The Chancellor of the Exchequer gave a spring statement which explicitly reserved any policy substance for her forthcoming Mace lecture, not for Parliament, and badly misrepresented the economic position this country is in. You would never know from what she said that we have the highest unemployment in this country since the pandemic and that youth unemployment is at a state of crisis. Meanwhile, she failed to mention, let alone publish, the Defence Investment Plan, which her department, the Treasury, has now held up for 9 months. The House will note the irony that a government that has never been willing to acknowledge the economic cost of the pandemic and the energy spike resulting from the war in Ukraine will now have to explain the economic effects of rapidly rising oil and gas prices due to the present conflict in the Gulf. We can only hope against hope, Mr. Speaker, that recent events will cause the Energy Secretary, a man with the worst judgment in politics, a man whom the Prime Minister wanted but was too weak to sack in the last reshuffle, to rethink his dangerously inadequate energy policy and refusal to develop North Sea oil and gas. Perhaps we will hear a U-turn in his statement later today. But unlike the Energy Secretary, the Leader of the House is a serious man, and I want to ask him a serious question. The government's official story, set out by the Prime Minister at the dispatch box yesterday, is that it has been preparing for a US attack for several weeks. These preparations include pre-locating missile and other weapon systems in the Middle East, though not sending a Type 45 frigate which remains in dock at Portsmouth and will not depart for more than a week after the start of the conflict. Little wonder our allies have been so critical of the UK response. The Prime Minister has also offered us a pre-prepared line on the legal position. This is that the present government regards defensive operations as legal, but that it is against international law for the UK, and so presumably, in his judgment, for the United States and Israel, to take preemptive action to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons, when it is the avowed policy of that state to use those weapons to destroy another sovereign state, Israel. This is, of course, the second time in a year that the US and Israel have acted against Iran, so all these issues have already been widely discussed across government. Yet it is now reported with some authority across the newspapers that the Prime Minister was actually minded to support the US attack on Friday evening and was forced to back down by a group of ministers, including the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary and, yes, the Energy Secretary. It's hard to see how these things can all be true, and they raise a host of questions. If the government has been preparing for an attack by the US and Israel for weeks, how can it be true that its policy was still undecided on Friday night? If the Prime Minister's view was that he was minded to support the attack, where does this leave the legal position now? Legal experts, including the noble Lord Panic, have criticised the government's position as not legally rational. That's a quote. But my concern is more basic: whether the government is making the legal position up as it goes along, just as the Blair government did with the Iraq War in 2003. Finally, it now looks like the Cabinet has taken a decision with which the Prime Minister fundamentally does not agree. How can he exercise leadership under such circumstances? I do not expect the Leader of the House to comment on Cabinet discussions in any detail, of course, but I'm sure the whole House would be grateful for any explanation he can give.